am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters. America needs creation, not destruction. Cooperation, not contempt. Security, not anarchy. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
But 100% people protest here today.
Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
America is broken. And this is coming from someone who loves his country so much that he studies and continues to study its history so that I can teach it to students. But the events of this past week have put things into such sharp focus. The murder of George Floyd at the hands of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who has been charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter, seemed to be the spark that finally lit the powder keg that America has been sitting on for quite some time. Floyd died under Chauvin's knee, and the entire incident was captured on camera. The video makes it online, and rightfully so, sparks outrage among those living in Minneapolis. That outrage led to protests, and these gatherings and protests led to pushback from police forces who responded with tear gas, smoke bombs, and mace. And these actions by the police only escalated the outrage felt by African Americans and others who had more than enough of seeing another black person killed by police when they were never a threat. The protests got louder, and soon violence broke out as lootings occurred and buildings were set on fire in the city. And as those in Minneapolis rallied, their actions took root in other American cities like Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., where people took to the streets demanding justice, all while facing police forces who upped their game by using non-lethal weapons like rubber bullets to subdue protesters. The president, seeing all of this unfold, decided to chime in, but instead of celebrating the actions that were happening in the streets by these protesters, as he did with those that stormed state capitals that were armed with weapons of war as they pushed back against police, or for even calling for calm, the president instead decides to fan the flames of violence by calling on the National Guard to enter cities like Minneapolis to stop and to quell these rioters and these protesters and to stop their rising up. Trump even went ahead and used pretty much the same rhetoric that was used by a racist police chief in Miami in the 1960s when there were protests happening down there. When looting starts, the shooting starts. And then on the date of this recording, Monday, June 1st, 2020, the president in the morning had a phone call with the governors around the United States and called them, quote, weak, called them, quote, jerks, and told them that they needed to, quote, dominate, end quote, these protesters by arresting them, throwing them in jail, giving them terms of 10 years in jail to stop them from doing what they've been doing. By now, if you're watching this and you are upset with anything that I've said, you've turned off this video, you've called me every name in the book, hell, you're probably insulting me in the comments down below. And to which I say, you know what? I don't care. It's fine, because you know what? You're seeing what's happening in the United States right now. You've already made up your mind about it, and nobody is going to change your mind, no how. And frankly, it's unfortunate, because the reason I had to start off this episode by recapping everything that's happened in the United States just over the past week is to bring you our larger point. When it comes to our nation's history, we tend to have selective memory as well as short-term memory. Because if it wasn't for uprisings and if it wasn't for riots, there might never have been a United States of America. In fact, in U.S. history classes, every single year, one of the most celebrated riots in our history is taught to students over and over again and is celebrated as a founding moment of our republic. But I promise you, you'll never hear one politician, one president, or even an average American say anything bad about it. So let's take you back to the year 1763, because remember, in history, as in all things in life, context is key. 1763, we have reached the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, if you prefer the alternate title. The British have defeated their enemies, and it cost a ton of money. So much money, in fact, that the British Parliament decide that in order to recoup the money that they used to win that war, they decide to start putting taxes on goods being shipped to the colonies. First, you have the Stamp Act of 1765, which places a tax on all paper products, ranging from newspapers to legal documents to playing cards. Then, in 1767, you have what are called the Townshend Acts, which place a tax on the following items: paper, lead, paint, glass, and tea. But why would you want to tax these items specifically? Let's think about this for a second. Let's remember, in the 1760s, early 1770s, the colonists are subjects of the crown. Hence, they are British citizens. And now that Britain has conquered more of this vast landscape that will become known as the United States of America, they are sending more and more goods to the colonies, which colonists are naturally buying up. However, you have to understand something too. There was a disconnect between British citizens, British subjects that were living in the colonies, and those that were living at the metropole in the United Kingdom. Britons who lived in the UK looked at colonists as if they were these just second-class, dirty citizens. They were country bumpkins. Yes, they were British citizens, but I mean, they weren't like one of us. They're just these farmers and they're laborers. And now they want to buy up all these items so that they can, make themselves look more luxurious, try to make themselves look more like us. So Britain, according to the historian T.H. Breen in his fascinating The Marketplace of Revolution, quote, turned the ingenuity of American consumers into a justification for parliamentary taxation. In other words, if these colonists could afford to pay for the privilege of owning goods so that they could come off as more luxurious and more high class like British people living in the United Kingdom, then there should be no problem with them having to pay an additional tax. Clearly they can afford it. However, as we've all learned time and time again in our U.S. history classes, the colonists become upset about these taxes being levied against them because they feel that taxes shouldn't be levied against them without proper representation in Parliament, hence the phrase, no taxation without representation. You can't tax us, we have no say in Parliament when it comes to the stuff you're taxing us on. Not to mention, in addition to taxes being levied against the government, there is a larger presence of British regular forces remaining in the colonies after the 7 Years' War. And colonists start to feel as if they're unnecessarily being policed by these British redcoats, and they are not happy about it. In fact, on March 5, 1770, anger at these redcoats boils over to the point that a group of colonists meet them in the street and start provoking them and taunting them and throwing snow and ice and oyster shells at them. A soldier's musket happens to discharge, but the British soldiers see that discharging of the musket as a call to fire on these colonists, which they do. 6 colonists are injured, 5 are killed on the spot on King Street in Boston, Massachusetts. The first one to die, a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, a free man of color. That event, that later becomes known as the Boston Massacre, upsets colonists even further because now they feel that they're not even safe on their own streets, and the powers that be have become a threat to their very livelihood. 1 month later, in April 1770, the Townshend Acts are repealed, except for the tax on tea. Why? Because tea is one of, if not the most popular drink throughout the colonies. Colonists can't get enough of drinking tea. They drink about 1.2 million pounds of this stuff every single year. To repeal a tax on tea would be to lose a massive revenue stream for the crown, so the tax remains in place. How do the colonists respond? They boycott the tea that's being shipped over from Britain, specifically from the East India Company, and they start smuggling in tea from Dutch companies instead. By the way, you want to know who one of the biggest tea smugglers in all of the colonies was? I'll give you a hint. His name is on the Declaration of Independence. Matter of fact, it's the biggest name on the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, John Hancock. So anyway, the smuggling of tea from these Dutch companies leaves the East India Company with tons of tea just in stockpiles in surplus, which is threatening them with bankruptcy. So in response, the Tea Act of 1773 is passed by Parliament. And this act actually makes tea from the East India Company a lot cheaper to buy than any other company that you would buy from, like significantly cheaper. However, a tax remains on the tea when it is brought into port at Boston Harbor. I believe it's 3 pence per pound, which still is a thorn in the side of colonists. Yes, the tea is now cheaper to buy, but you're still taxing us without representation in Parliament. You ain't getting it, King George III. What are you not hearing from us? So groups like the Sons of Liberty, which consist of colonists that are celebrated very much throughout United States history, guys like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere. Groups like the Sons of Liberty continue to protest ships that are coming into Boston Harbor. But these groups also are having meetings to discuss what else they can do to get their point across that they're mad as hell about being taxed, that they're mad about not having parliamentary representation. They're trying to get the point across, look, how can you keep treating us like second-class, third-class citizens when we are British citizens subject to the same rights and privileges as all other British citizens? And they keep having these meetings because they're realizing very quickly that protests and boycotts aren't working anymore. Cut to December 16, 1773, when the ship, the Dartmouth, along with its sister ships, the Beaver and the Eleanor, are making their way into Boston Harbor, packed with chests of tea. That same day, that morning, thousands of colonists, initially they were supposed to have a meeting at Faneuil Hall in Boston, but because so many colonists showed up, they had to move the meeting to a place where they could, accommodate thousands upon thousands of colonists who all showed up for this meeting to determine what they were going to do about this tea that was coming into Boston Harbor. At the meeting, a vote is taken, and it is decided that they will not pay taxes on that tea. Moreover, it is decided that the tea on those ships is not to be unloaded, is not to be sold, is not to be distributed. That tea is not going to make it off of those boats. We all know this part of the story. A large group of men dressed as Native Americans, complete with feathers in their hair, war paint, tomahawks. They board the 3 ships and smash and destroy 342 chests of tea and dump them into the harbor. In total, the men do around, in today's money, $1 million of damage. And naturally, the British Governor Thomas Hutchinson, is upset. And he calls the uprising a treasonous act. But colonists from Boston to New York to Philadelphia, they love it. They love the actions that were carried out by those men. In fact, John Adams himself says of the Boston Tea Party, quote, "It was the most magnificent movement of all. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible." But it is this act, however, that then leads the crown to pass what becomes known as the Intolerable Acts in 1774. What do the Intolerable Acts do? Here's what they do. First, they stop all ships from coming into Boston Harbor until the damages from the Boston Tea Party are repaid. Boston residents are forced to house and quarter British troops whenever British troops demand it. It moved judicial powers back to Britain and to British judges, and it ends free elections of town officials. And it is these intolerable acts which bring colonists even closer together and lead to the creation of the First Continental Congress. And then 1 year later, in April of 1775, the first shots of the American War for Independence are fired at Lexington and Concord. And then another year later, in 1776, the Second Continental Congress, a group of people which were brought together by the Intolerable Acts, which were spurred on because of what happened with the Boston Tea Party, draft and approve a Declaration of Independence. Acts of rebellion, uprising, and resistance against the powers that be led to the creation of an independent nation. Which is why, in the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson made sure to include that it is, quote, the right of the people, end quote, to abolish forms of government that would attempt to destroy these rights. It's why the freedoms to petition and assemble are in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Because in a free society, guys, the people should and must exercise the right to voice their discontent with what's happening when they feel threatened, abandoned, forgotten, or treated unequally. These protests that are happening in the streets right now follow a blueprint that was laid down by the Boston Tea Party. And just to be clear, before you even think about trying to jump down my throat, no, I am not a fan of, nor do I condone the violence, the lootings, the fires that have occurred during these protests. Because if you look at videos that are being posted on television and on social media, you'll notice that more often than not, those actions are not being carried out by protesters. They're being carried out by agitators who are using this national movement to carry out their own agendas, and usually under the cover of night because they are cowards. Do not conflate the actions of those agitators with those marching in the streets, those patriots marching in the streets, because that's what those people are in the streets, guys. They are patriots. They are those who love their country but will not excuse its sins, if you'll let me paraphrase Frederick Douglass. Because at the end of the day, guys, as corny and as cliche and as hokey as it sounds, we're all we've got. We're all Americans together, now more than ever. If we have each other's back and learn from our mistakes, instead of simply passing the blame off to groups of people we don't understand or interact with, we can move forward. If not, acts of violence against BIPOC Americans will continue on, and the cycle starts all over again. And we will have learned nothing except how to remain intolerant and ignorant. And the lessons of our past will serve as nothing more than mandatory paragraphs inside of a history book that students will read over and over again, but fail to grasp the larger lesson. That's it for this episode of US 101, guys. Thanks so much for sticking around. I know this was a video that was longer than I wanted it to be, but if you stuck around till the end, I can't thank you enough for hearing me out this whole time. Down in the description box, I put links to organizations that you can donate to during this time. But more importantly than that, let me just end on this note. If you're unhappy with the way things are right now, if you are frustrated, if you are angry, if you are scared, like I am, one of the biggest things you can do is come November, vote. There are millions of us in the streets right now voicing our disdain for the government, for the system, for leadership. I really hope that all that energy that's being exerted in the streets right now also shows up at the ballot box come November. If you don't like what you see, change it. You have the right to. We have the right to, as Americans. Vote in November, please. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am all done. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Sandra Bland, Laquan McDonald, Atatiana Jefferson, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Dominique Clayton, Botham Jean, Tanisha Anderson, Izelle Ford, Natasha McKenna.